train hadn't touched Los Angeles in 11 days, and it still didn't touch it now, but Soo-min Yoon felt the weight of a storm anyway, pressing down on the black lace at her collar as she stood over her father's casket, and refused to cry in front of people who would call her weakness a debt to be collected later. The funeral home on Wilshire smelled of lilies and old money, the kind of arrangement her father would have hated. Too soft, too apologetic, nothing like the man who had run half of Koreatown's underground economy from the back room of a dry cleaner's for 22 years. She had flown in from Seattle 4 hours after the call, had not slept, had not eaten, had done nothing but sit in a rental car outside the mortuary and practice the particular stillness her father used to call the Yoon face, the one that gave nothing away, not even to family. She needed it now more than she ever had, because Dae-hyun Ahn had just walked through the door. He didn't belong here. That was the first thing her body understood before her mind caught up, some ancient recognition system flaring red at the sight of him in a charcoal suit too. Well cut to be anything but a statement, his dark hair pushed back, his expression arranged into something that might have passed for respect if she hadn't spent her whole childhood being told exactly what his family had cost hers. The Ahns didn't send flowers to Baeko funerals. The Ahns didn't attend Baeko funerals. And yet there he was, moving through the small crowd of her father's old lieutenants, like he owned the air in the room. And every one of those men who used to swing her onto their shoulders at New Year's, men who had sworn blood oaths to her father, dropped their eyes when he passed, the way you look away from something that could kill you if it decided to. She crossed the room before she'd decided to move, heels striking the tile hard enough to turn heads. "You have some nerve," she said, low enough that it wouldn't carry, sharp enough that he'd feel it anyway. "Get out. I came to pay respects." His voice was quieter than she remembered from the handful of times she'd seen him across rooms she'd been dragged into as a teenager, quieter and steadier, and it made her want to break something. "Your father was a serious man, he deserves that much. My father is dead because men like your father decided serious wasn't the same as untouchable." The words came out before she could file the edges off them, and she watched something pass behind his eyes. Not guilt, she didn't think Ahns were built for guilt, but a kind of tired recognition, like he'd heard some version of this sentence in his own house, aimed at his own name. "So don't stand here and tell me about respect. Tell me why you're really here." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the casket, toward the framed photograph beside it. Her father at 50, unsmiling, the way he always insisted on being photographed, and something in his jaw tightened before he looked back at her. Because in 8 days, 3 different families are going to move on what's left of the Baeko territory, he said, and I would rather you hear it from me than find out when they're already inside your door. The floor didn't move, but it felt like it did. Around them, the funeral continued its quiet choreography of bowed heads and murmured condolences, utterly unaware that the balance of an entire underworld had just shifted 6 inches from the guest book. "That's not your problem," she said, but even as she said it, she heard how thin it sounded. "It's not," he agreed, "until my father decides it's an opportunity, and believe me, he already has." The words that would define the next 8 days where they honestly say next del wish if flat calm of a man reading out a verdict he'd had no part in writing, that the Jangmi Council would meet in a week, that a formal alliance between their families, sealed, binding, public, was the only structure strong enough to keep 3 separate walls from tearing the Baeko name apart before she'd even had the chance to bury her father properly, and that his own father had sent him here tonight not to grieve but to make the offer before someone else made a different one. An alliance. Marriage, dressed up in the language of business, the same ugly transaction her family had spent decades warning her about, except now it wore the face of the one man in Los Angeles she had been raised to hate on sight. "You're asking me to marry into the family that killed my father," she said, and her voice finally cracked just once, just enough for him to hear it. "At his funeral. I'm telling you what's coming whether you marry me or not," Dae-hyun said. "The marriage is just the only door I can see that doesn't end with you burying the rest of what he built." He held her gaze, and for one unbearable second she thought she saw something almost like apology in it, before it hardened back into the composed mask his family had no doubt trained into him since birth. "You have a week to decide, Soo-min. I'll be at the house Thursday." He left before she could throw the water glass she was already reaching for. Thursday arrived with a headache and a stack of ledgers her father's accountant had dropped at her door that morning. Each page a fresh lesson in exactly how much the Baco Empire had been quietly rotting from the inside for the last 3 years. Loans against loans, favours called in. Territory bled out one street corner at a time to cover debts nobody had told her existed. By the time Dae-hyun's car pulled into the gravel drive at 6 that evening, she had a folder of numbers that made her stomach hurt in a decision she still hated herself for making. He came alone, which surprised her, no bodyguards trailing him up the walkway. Just him in a plain black coat that made him look younger than she remembered him being, like the boy who used to sit 2 straight at those long ceremonial dinners while their fathers traded coded threats over rice wine. She met him at the door with the folder already in her hand because she refused to let him think she needed time to be talked into anything. "Terms," she said, before he'd even crossed the threshold. "If we're doing this, I want it in writing, and I want every clause read out loud, because I don't trust a single word that comes out of an Ahn mouth without a witness in the room." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something more complicated than that. "Fair," he said, and stepped past her into the house that had raised her, looking around at the dark wood and the framed photographs of a family he'd been taught to see as an obstacle, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence thick with everything that stood between them. Blood on both sides, old and dried, but never scrubbed clean. They sat across from each other at the same table where her father used to hold court, and she watched Dae-hyun Ahn lay out the terms of an alliance that would bind her name to his for as long as either of them lived, and somewhere underneath the fury she still couldn't put down, she felt something else stir, small. Unwelcome, and impossible to name yet, except to say that when his eyes met hers across the table, she was the one who looked away first. That would want to be its own chapter of catastrophe. She thought later, the Wei War broke out 4 days, before the alliance was even formalised. A strike on Biko-held blocks near 6th Street, 3 of her father's remaining men beaten and left in an alley with a message stitched into the violence unmistakably. "Move now, before the Ahn girl learns to fight back." She was in the middle of screaming into a phone at a lieutenant who wanted to retaliate before she'd even confirmed who ordered it, when Dae-hyun's car pulled up outside for the 2nd time that week. No appointment, no warning, just him climbing out with his jaw set, and 2 of his own men flanking him for the first time she'd seen. "You knew," she said the moment he was close enough to hear her, fury doing what grief hadn't let her do all week, finally breaking loose. "You knew this was coming and you let me sign that folder without telling me." "I didn't know," he said, and something in the flatness of it, the sheer absence of performance, made her believe him despite herself. "But I know who did it, and if we don't move together tonight, by tomorrow there won't be a Baco territory left to protect." He held out a hand, not for her to take, just an offering laid open in the space between them. "Whatever we are to each other, Soo-min, tonight, we're on the same side. Let me prove that." She looked at his hand for a long moment, at the rival's face attached to it, at the 8 days of grief and math and fury that had brought her to this exact doorway, and she made the decision that would change the shape of everything that came after. "Fine," she said. "But if you're lying to me, Dae-hyun, I will burn your family down with my own hands, and I won't lose a single night's sleep over it." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. And forth her first year watching him walking to her first funeral, something that looked almost like respect passed between them. Dangerous, unfamiliar, and impossible to take back. The vulnerability cracked open 3 nights later, in a kitchen that had gone quiet after the fighting stopped. They'd spent 2 days in a war neither of them had chosen. Retaliation against the crew that struck the Baco blocks, a joint operation that put Dae-hyun's men and what remained of her father's men in the same rooms for the first time in a generation. An alliance tested by fire before it had even been formalised on paper. By the time the immediate threat was neutralised, the rival crew's leader in custody of the Jangmi's private justice, the message sent that touching Baiko territory now meant touching Ahn territory too, Soo-min hadn't slept in almost 60 hours, and when Dae-hyun found her sitting on the floor of her father's kitchen at 2 in the morning, back against the cabinets, staring at nothing, he didn't say a word. He just sat down across from her, close enough that their knees almost touched, and waited. "He used to make tea here," she said, finally, not looking at him. Every night, no matter what happened during the day. Didn't matter if someone had tried to kill him that afternoon. He'd come home and make tea like the world hadn't tried to end. Her voice caught, and she hated that it caught. Hated that, of all the people in Los Angeles to witness her father's daughter finally breaking, it had to be an Ahn. I don't know how to run any of this. I don't know how he did it for 22 years without losing his mind. He didn't do it alone, Dae-hyun said quietly. Nobody does. Not even my father, whatever he wants people to believe. He reached over, not touching her, just closing the distance enough that his voice didn't have to travel far. You're not alone in this either, Soo-min. Whatever else is true between our families, that part isn't a lie. I meant it when I said we're on the same side now. She turned to look at him then, really look, past the enemy's face she'd been trained since childhood to see, and into something else entirely. A man who had also grown up under the crushing weight of a name he didn't choose, who had also learned to make his face say nothing, while his chest carried everything. Why does that terrify me more than the men who tried to kill us this week? She asked, half a laugh, half something rawer. Because it should, he said. It terrifies me too. Neither of them moved for a long moment. And then, for reasons she would spend days trying to justify to herself afterward, she let her head rest against his shoulder just for a moment, just long enough to remember what it felt like not to carry the entire weight of a dying empire alone. The betrayal scare came 4 days before the alliance ceremony, wearing the shape of a photograph. It arrived by courier, no return address. A single image slid into a plain envelope left on her desk. Dae-hyun, deep in conversation with a man Soo-min recognized instantly as one of the 3 families circling her territory since her father's death. The same family whose crew had struck the Baiko blocks. The photo was time-stamped 2 nights before the retaliation, before he'd shown up at her door claiming to be on her side, before any of it. She stared at it until her hands stopped shaking long enough to make a decision, and then she called him and told him to come to the house and said nothing else. He arrived within the hour, and she didn't wait for him to sit down before she threw the photograph onto the table between them. Explain this, she said. Before I decide everything you've told me this week was a performance to get my family's territory without having to fight for it. He picked up the photograph, and she watched his face for the lie, braced for it, half expecting it, and instead watched something harder settle into his jaw. Something that looked less like guilt and more like fury, directed somewhere else entirely. That man is my father's contact, he said. Not mine. I was there because I found out 3 days before you did that this meeting was happening, and I went to find out exactly what they were planning against your family, against us. Before it happened, I didn't tell you because I didn't have proof yet, and I didn't want you going to war over a rumor. That's convenient. It's the truth, and I know how it looks, which is exactly why I didn't want to say it without something to back it up. He set the photograph down, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something crack in his careful composure. Not anger at her, but something rawer, almost wounded. You think I don't know what it costs me every time I choose you over the family I was born into? My father already thinks I've gone soft. Do you have any idea what it means that I'm standing in this house, defending myself to a Becco, instead of sitting in a room with my own father deciding how to carve up what's left of yours? The silence between them stretched taut enough to snap. She wanted to believe him, that was the terrifying part, that some part of her had already decided to believe him before he'd said a single word. And she didn't know if that made her a fool, or if it made this real. Prove it, she said, finally, quieter now. Not to me. To the council. In 4 days. When this alliance becomes real in front of everyone who's waiting for one of us to flinch, prove which family you actually belong to. I intend to, he said. Watch me. He proved it 2 nights before the ceremony, at a cost that made her understand, finally, and completely, exactly what she had gotten both of them into. The confrontation happened in the same concrete room where the Jiang Mi settled its oldest debts. She wasn't supposed to know about it, but word travelled fast in a world this small, and by the time she arrived, breathless and furious that no one had told her, Dae-hyun was already standing across from his own father's lieutenant, the man from the photograph, laying out in front of the assembled council exactly what he'd uncovered. Proof. Real proof. Documents and recordings that traced the attack on Biko territory back to a faction within his own father's ranks, men who wanted the alliance broken before it could bind 2 powerful families into something too strong to challenge. You're accusing your own house, the lieutenant said, low and dangerous, in front of a Baco. I'm telling the truth in front of the council, Dae-hyun said, which is more than I can say for you. He turned, briefly, and found Soo-min's eyes across the room, a look that held everything he hadn't said yet, every risk he was taking with his own name to make her believe him, before he turned back and finished dismantling, piece by piece, the conspiracy that had nearly cost her everything. It cost him standing within his own family that night. She watched two of his father's oldest allies walk out of the room rather than hear him finish, watched the weight of that exile settle onto his shoulders in real time. But he didn't stop, didn't soften a single word, until the truth was laid bare in front of every power broker who mattered in Koreatown. Afterward, in the empty hallway, she found him alone, jaw tight, hands still shaking slightly with the adrenaline of having just publicly split his own house down the middle for her sake. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, I did, he said, because if I let that stand, everything I've told you this week means nothing. He looked at her then, really looked, the careful mask finally, fully gone. I chose a side tonight, Soo-min. I need you to understand that it wasn't the Baco territory, it was you. She closed the distance between them before either of them could talk themselves out of it. The alliance ceremony in 2 days about to turn a business arrangement into something neither family could have predicted, and neither of them walking away from it now. The ceremony took place at dusk in the same courtyard where 3 generations of Jangmi leadership had sealed their most binding agreements, lanterns strung between the trees, the entire council assembled to witness the formal joining of 2 houses that had spent decades trying to destroy each other. Soo-min stood in red, her mother's colour, worn deliberately, a quiet claim, staked in front of Ivrion, who had once written the Baco name off as finished. And when Dae-hyun took her hand in front of the gathered families, the performance that 2 of them had agreed to 8 days ago, in grief and desperation had become something else entirely, something real enough that neither of them had to fake the way their fingers laced together. Some of you came here expecting a transaction, Dae-hyun said to the assembled council, his voice carrying across the courtyard with a steadiness that dared anyone to challenge it. What you're witnessing instead is a choice. Both of us made it freely, and both of us will defend it, together, against anyone who thought this alliance was weak enough to break. Soo-min felt the weight of every eye in that courtyard, felt the ghost of her father's approval and disapproval both, felt 8 days of grief and war and fury settle into something that finally felt like solid ground instead of freefall. My father built something out of nothing, she said, and buried men who thought that made it fragile. This doesn't end what he built. It protects it. She looked at Dae-hyun, and the words that came next surprised her with how true they felt. And it does something he never got the chance to. It makes peace out of a war neither of us started. The council bowed, one by one, the old rivalries folding, not vanishing, never entirely vanishing in a world like theirs, but bending for tonight, towards something new. Dae-hyun's hand tightened around hers, and beneath the lantern light in front of 200 years of combined bloodshed between their houses, he leaned down and kissed her, not a performance this time, not a transaction, but a claim as real as the rose tattoo his family wore like a brand, sealing something neither of them could undo, even if they wanted to. It should have ended there. It would have ended there if a third family hadn't been watching from the shadowed edge of the courtyard. A man Soo-min didn't recognize, studying the new alliance with the flat, calculating patience of someone already planning how to break it. 6 weeks passed before the peace began cracking at the edges. The third family revealed itself as the Beck. No relation to Soo-min's house, despite the near-identical name, a coincidence her father used to call a cruel joke, from whatever god ran the underworld's sense of humour. Cho Beck had spent 30 years building a smuggling network that ran quietly beneath both the Jangmi and the old Baco territories, untouched because he'd never been ambitious enough to draw attention, until the wedding of 2 rival houses handed him the exact kind of instability he'd been waiting his whole career to exploit. The first move came disguised as a courtesy call. Soo-min was reviewing shipping manifests in the office that had once been her father's, Dae-hyun's idea, keeping the Baco name active on every document instead of folding it quietly into the Ahn holdings, a decision that had cost him more political capital, with his own father's remaining loyalists, than either of them liked to admit, when her assistant told her a man named Beck was requesting 15 minutes unarmed alone. She almost said no. 6 weeks of consolidating two houses into something that functioned as one had taught her, exactly how many unarmed alone meetings turned into something else entirely. But something in the request's phrasing, deliberate, almost old-fashioned in its formality, made her curious enough to say yes, with 4 of her own men positioned within earshot. Cho Beck turned out to be older than she expected, silver at his temples, dressed like a man who'd spent smucking himself for her on purpose. He sat across from her with his hands visible on the table the entire time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular calm of someone who the conversation will before he walks in. "I'll be direct, since I understand directness is valued in this house now," he said. "Your alliance with the Ahn family solved a problem for both of your father's old rivals. It created a much larger one for me." He let that sit for a moment. "For 30 years, 3 houses kept each other in careful balance, and I built my business in the space between them, where no single family had enough attention to notice what moved through their territory. You and Dae-hyun didn't just merge 2 houses, Mrs. Ahn. You erased the space I've been living in." "That's not my problem," Soo-min said. "It will be," Baek said, not unkindly, almost like a warning offered in good faith. "Because I intend to make it yours before you make it mine. I'd rather we discuss terms now, while this is still a conversation, than let it become the kind of disagreement your predecessors specialized in." He rose, buttoned his jacket, and paused at the door. "You have something now that neither house had alone, real strength, and a marriage strong enough that people believe it. I'd think carefully about what you're willing to lose defending it." He left without waiting for a response, and Soo-min sat alone in her father's old office for a long time afterward, turning the shape of the threat over in her mind, before she picked up the phone to call the one person who needed to hear it before anyone else did. Dae-hyun arrived within the hour, and when she told him what Beck had said, she watched the same careful stillness settle over his face that she'd learned in 6 weeks of marriage meant he was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation, already calculating exactly how much of their combined territory a man like Cho Baek could actually threaten, and exactly how far he was willing to go to make sure the answer was none of it. "He's not wrong that we changed the board," Dae-hyun said finally, "but he's wrong if he thinks we're not ready for what comes next." He reached across the desk and took her hand, the same gesture that had once been performance and was now simply instinct, and when he looked at her, the resolve in his expression was unmistakable. "Whatever Baek is planning, Soo-min, we face it the way we faced the last one, together or not at all." She thought of the courtyard, the lanterns, the vow neither of them had faked even when they'd started out pretending. "Together," she agreed. "Let's find out exactly what he thinks he can take from us." Outside, the sun was setting over a Koreatown that had no idea yet how close it stood to another war,